Mr. Manuel is Director of Resources of the South Australian College of Advanced Education, having previously been Campus Director of the South Australian College of Advanced Education, Salisbury, and before that, Assistant Director at Murray Park and Hartley Colleges of Advanced Education. He's taught literature and economics at secondary and tertiary levels in South Australia and was a high school headmaster. His interests, his academic interests, are in Australian names, Australian accents. See the plural there, Australian accents, interesting. 19th century South Australian social history and early 20th century Australian literature. And he did a master's degree with a thesis on Adelaide's journalism in the 1840s and 50s. And of course is one of the authors in our Society's prized journal. I'm not a historian, and I have a horrible suspicion that I shouldn't be here at all. If it hadn't been for the persuasion of my so-called friend Ron at the back, I suspect I would have talked my way out of this position some time ago. But in any case, here I am. I'm pleased to be here. My interests, today's talk at least, are still about journalism, but journalism is only by my definition, I think, regarded as one of the arts, and whether it's lively or not is a question of perception. I personally find the journalism that I've read most in the 1840s and 50s, a particularly lively part of journalism. But I was looking forward to hearing John explain what I was going to talk about so that I could link it up with the general theme of the seminar. But having that handicap still with me, I better proceed. I got a double advantage, though. I noticed in the documentation I had two topics to work on. I don't want to really talk about either of them, but the first one was, as Eric announced, Adelaide's literati in the mid-19th century. And the second was some aspects of 19th century South Australian literature. I really am thoroughly ashamed of the first title. I have to accept responsibility for it. It's just as pretentious and pompous as so much of the writing of the time that it fits it very nicely, but I really shouldn't have inflicted it on you. And there are some concerns about talking about South Australian literature, because there are problems of definitions of what is literature and what are South Australians. And later on I'll try and flounder through the morass of definitions, so at least I have some indication of direction. But I think the point of talking about South Australian literature when the colony was so young, and when to hear an Australian voice would have been a rarity, does present some sort of intellectual difficulties to me. I noticed Eric raised his eyebrows about the plural accents, and that's not what I'm going to talk about today. But it always came to me as a wonder, and I can't understand why I wondered, that when you read all that lovely prose of the explorers, that had they read their prose, it would not have been an Australian voice. It would have been in some outlandish English dialect. And the notion of those great Australian achievements being achieved by people who don't sound like Australians puzzled me then and puzzles me still. And I guess as I try to recreate my imagination the Adelaide of the 1830s and 40s and 50s, that same problem dogs me. There would be a few Australian voices coming over from New South Wales, that despised colony to the east. And some of them would have brought Australian accents that Commissioner Biggs is to be believed. But most South Australians, as we would define them, wouldn't sound like Australians of any description. And some of the examples I talk about later on will illustrate why that should be so. I suppose the most respectable form of the arts as far as literature is concerned is poetry. And I ought to say that I can't imagine any poem that I've read in the 1840s and 50s would survive the kind of critic examination that you'd give a poem these days. Most of it is goddamn awful. I suppose there's not to be wondered at, because gentlemen, not gentle ladies as a rule, but gentlemen usually wrote poetry as an extension of their school training, doing their classics and then putting it into verse forms. And most of their English poetry comes out that way too. Most of the poetry that I read is earnest, improving, derivative, at best metrified prose. Sometimes it's unwittingly funny. I didn't bring on examples of those, but there are a couple on Sturt's Return to Adelaide, which have a couple of deathless lines in. They become deathless not because of the intention of the day, but the words have shifted meaning somewhat, as Gay has these days. Here's a typical poem by Pallades called A Sonnet Addressed to One Who Lately Subscribed Himself a Lover of Mankind. You can hardly wait, can you? Such numbers style themselves, but what is love? when manifested, how evinced by those who feel its warmth and in whose heated clothes. For me, no sign of it doth ever prove its existence as I lonely rove along the world's highway, and anxious cast inquiring looks on those who hurry past. Looks that the tenderest sympathy would move. I hear no answer to the words that speak from out my heart of hearts, requiring one to love beyond all others, one alone of all men loving me. In vain I seek the treasure. Will there be mine to own? Will there light so gladsome on me break? Well, perhaps a couple of moments for reflection on that gem. But I think it's all too typical. It's attitudinising, it's phony, and it's not Australian. It really is nothing. It's not poetry, it's not anything. Excepting it's an attempt, I think, to practice skills learnt at school, to transform a very prosaic kind of sentiment into some kind of half-regular poetic form. But perhaps the nature of colonial verse tells us more about the versifier's parameters than it does about their powers of observation or their sensibilities. I'm preparing for retirement at the present time, and I set myself my task to reread Jane Austen with great care. And I read Mansfield Park. I never did like it. I wondered, is it me? I suspect that still is me. But it struck me what a dreadful describer of landscape she is. And isn't she handicapped in the same way as that poet is handicapped by the expectations of what landscape, how landscape should be described? It's all generalised, non-particular, imprecise, full of phony rhapsodies. And those limitations you find in a lot of colonial verse in the journals of the day. Yet in some ways you could expect the would-be poets of colonial times to write in that kind of fashion when you have one of their editors, one of the four important writers of the time, James Allen, who was the editor of a variety of South Australian newspapers, who urged latent literary talents to look abroad with the eyes of a philosopher, and we shall find, as has been beautifully expressed, that we cannot pick up a pebble from the brook without finding all nature in connection with it. People tend to write poetry with that kind of injunction in mind, I feel. Yet the oddity is that people who wrote such non-particularised verse were very often very minute observers of landscape when practical concerns were involved. Some of the best writing in the prose, I think, has come from explorers and from people who are looking over landscape with an eye for geological discovery, or looking over landscape with a view for pasturage or farming. And some of their description is precise in the extreme and shows a keen sensibility, but it doesn't come out in poetry, I feel. A trifle more lively in the verse field is the verse dealing with individuals or local events. Not unexpectedly, it tends to be parodic, and some of the rare local hits, quote, have strayed off target over the intervening years. But at least it has what the abstruse sentimentals never did, a firm basis in reality, and genuine, if not very uplifting feeling. A concern to say something colourless, based on real experience, rather than coloured by attitudinising. And so you find a good deal of the verse which is writing about Australia's climates, quote, its varied and delightful scenery, its rising hills and noble plains, its rich, umbrageous and affluent forests, its microscopic resemblance to the older country and the bustling activities of city life, and its mimic representations of the wild sports of the West in the emu or kangaroo hunts of the interior. The derivativeness of it and the language of the 18th century pastoral comes out even in that piece of prose. But before dismissing colonial poetry as the least lively of its literary arts, perhaps I should quote one or two examples which have interest to the modern reader, not because of the literary charms necessarily, but because of the light they throw on colonial South Australia. I begin first with a not unskillful parody, and end with a piece of unashamed and admitted doggerel. The parody's on Goldsmith's song for the Vicar of Wakefield, when lovely lady stoops to folly. The T.S. Eliot made rather better use of its parody later on. But it's a quite good piece of parody, and has the advantage of introducing two of the four journalists that I believe had a great impact on South Australia's lively arts in the 1840s and 50s. The author of it, almost certainly William Hammond, who was the editor of the Mercury and Sporting Chronicle at the end of the 1840s and beginning of the 1850s, and the certain victim of it, James Allen, Dismal Jemmy as he was known, who was editor of a variety of newspapers, including the Adelaide Times. When Dismal Jemmy gets too jolly and late at roadside pubs doth stray, what you conceal a creature's folly who lushes when he ought to pray. The only way to get his hand in the next day's leaders long and dry is clapping into bed, all standing, for in broad sheets he's used to lie. For the slow-witted, the more obvious puns are capitalised. The libels have lost their power to offend. But there are a couple of interesting bits in the parody in itself. Firstly, it's quite skillful, it's quite good humoured. And it's always a salutary reminder when so much writing was so earnest that there was a great deal of humour in the 1840s and 50s. Some wasn't too kindly, but it was vigorous, and I think that's a kind of energy which newspaper writing has never recovered, in my view. There are a couple of interesting linguistic things in that parody. The use of pubs, for instance, is noteworthy. It predates the OED's first reference by 15 years, and Eric Partridge's historical slang by 9. That wouldn't surprise you, of course, because it would have been a colloquial usage, and getting it into a literary form is almost an accidental thing. But in fact, it was obviously current in the colony before the OED took notice of it. And the use of lushes is an interesting word. It's no longer, I think the cream-coated private eye detectives still use lushes for those blondes draped up their bars. But I think it's, as a word, it's almost disappeared as a verb, but an interesting linguistic effect. But I think the reason why I quote it is that the parody reminds us that there are other sides to the colonial character: irreverence, malice, and a good deal of reckless pugnacity. There's little to distinguish the piece of doggerel which follows, except its value of those historians who wished to populate the shops of Adelaide as they were in 1950, and who wished to glimpse some of the racial tensions of the time. Entitled Walks in Adelaide, the following is one of a lengthy series published and probably written by Hammond of the Mercury and Sporting Chronicle, a paper which I'm very fond. I think it ran for about 15 walks, and it's in heroic couplets of a kind. At Lee Street now our steps will bend, though we at first did not intend on other subjects here to treat than what are found in the main street. But as we turned us from our course, we were calling at the Sable Horse, where lately Thespis reared a fame, but had to pull it down again. While creeps and potboys mourn its fall, and sigh o'er the dramatic hall, no more in sock and buskin's pride shall Jacob's or great Gardiner stride that spacious stage, which all must weep, 'twas 4 feet long and 2 feet deep. Where are those sons of Roscius fled? Far doth Gardiner hide his head, but Jacob still, with aspect pale, a prisoner now, though out on bail, lingers about that much-loved spot, and to the hills bewails his lot, cursing the injudicious daring which led him into such hard swearing, to bolster up, for sake of pelf, a greater liar than himself. I saw in the documentation earlier, when this seminar was proposed, that Mr. Fisher was going to talk about the local theatre. I regret that's not part of our programme. This itself alludes to a very short-lived dramatic hall, a vaudeville theatre, which was held in the Black Bull in Lee Street in the late 1840s, and provides a nice little counterbalance to the better established commercial theatre in the Queen's Theatre in, what's it called these days? Playhouse Lane. Whose idea was it to change it, by the way, Ron?
I don't know.
Well, that should be a shame of himself. In any case, to go a little further down the street, ere we seek Harley Street again, we'll visit honest Pat McLean, an emeralder of sterling worth, who boasts his birthplace in the north. For loyal soldiers long renowned, no treason thrives on Ulster's ground. I like that one. But though in spring prompt to join, you'll never hear Pat toast the Boyne, much more intent upon the ball which opens his St. Patrick's Hall. Across the road where hammers clang and swarthy Cyclops iron bang, dwells Pybus, who like Tubal Cain, in metal worked with monstrous gain, for day and night those anvils ring, with sounds with thoughts that Vulcan bring. But such hard subjects now we drop, for Hall the plumber's handsome shop. And I won't read any more than this, I think you get a taste of it there. There's references to some of the Carlton's baking powders. There's a reference to peaches so luscious, ripe and red, soft as old Billy Giles' head. A not very respectful reference to William Giles at the South Australian Company. And it goes along in this strain, in this extract and in many others like it. It's got a kind of life about it though, but for the historian, I think it does throw a great deal of light on the nature and the texture of South Australian society. Later on I referred to a much quoted example from St Patrick's Society meeting, which is described in prose, but you get a glimpse, I think, of the colonial nature of South Australian society, even from a piece of doggerel of that kind. I said earlier that I had no particular wish to puddle in the morass of definitions, but I will in fact be talking about what I've defined as South Australian writing, simply writing written by men and women who were living in South Australia at the time of writing and addressed it specifically to a South Australian audience. That puts it on pretty safe ground. I've got too many vivid recollections of those aimless discussions in literature classes deciding whether D.H. Lawrence's Kangaroo was part of the canon of Australian literature or not, or whether Trollope and Mark Twain became temporary colonials when they happened to write about colonial society when they were visiting here. But my definition, I think, does at least confine it to those which had a reality as a South Australian member, even though many of their memberships were short and many moved out of the colony soon after writing. The thing I wanted to stress, it's obvious for people who read newspapers in any kind of fashion, but there is a sense of continuity in the papers of 1840 and 1850, continuity not with the newspapers in the other colonies, but continuity with the newspapers at home, as it was called. And so when an editor would talk about our contemporaries, he would expect his readers to lump together not only those papers in Sydney, say the Sydney Morning Herald or Hobart Town Advertiser or the Port Phillip Standard, but the major papers in the English circuit, particularly the Times, Sporting Life, Bell's Life, and papers of that order. I've always been aware that when I speak about newspapers that my more fastidious colleagues and students of literature dismiss as negligible most forms of 9th century writing in the journals, even though among its distinguished practitioners were Dickens and Gerald and Leigh Hunt, and if we include the periodical journals, De Quincey and James Hogg and Hazlitt and Charles Lamb and John Wilson and countless others. Yet within the narrow literary circles of Adelaide of the mid-19th century, it's plain that the bulk of most of the vital writing came not from the amateurs, the gentlemen known to have the public at home under deep obligation by their stated or occasional contributions to the general stock of periodical literature, nor the many ladies among us to whom the periodical press in Great Britain is to a greater or less degree indebted, but from hard-working, underpaid journalists like James Allen, like William Hammond, George Stevenson and John Stevens, I think, the big four as far as I'm concerned in the journalism of the time. The amateurs wrote a good deal, I mustn't underestimate the contribution, but they too often wrote not to please and to entertain, but to instruct, to improve, and not uncommonly to show off. The professional journalist dare not adopt too many lordly airs if he were to escape the penury that became the lot of many who didn't have private means or alternative sources of income. Job printing, as most of them did, selling patent medicines, as John Stevens did, or earning favours from the Licensed Victuallers Association, as William Hammond did by being their secretary and touting the pubs at every opportunity, or by public service and horticulture, as George Stevenson did. But there was some very good writing from the amateurs. For the short time that George French Angus was in Adelaide, he wrote some good prose and quite respectable verse. And Nathaniel Hales made a long contribution to the literature of South Australia when he was in Port Lincoln and in Adelaide. The actor, publican William Ackhurst, wrote some good prose and half respectable verse, and Thomas Wilson. And Catherine Spence, I think, is in a class of her own. I don't want to talk about Catherine Spence because I think she mucks up my case. I belatedly read Paul de Pasquale's critical history of South Australian literature, and he gives Catherine Spence a very rough hand indeed, totally undeserved in my view. In fact, what Sinnott said in the 1850s about literature in Australia, I think, is still substantially true. At that particular time, the outstanding novel was Claire Morrison, and for all its weaknesses, I still think it is a charmer, and a 19th century novel can charm after all this time is no mean novel indeed. But there's too often the writing of the amateurs of this sort of stuff. Majestic ocean, can I look on thee without a feeling of sublime delight? such a question doesn't really have any have an honest answer. It's only no is the only possible you can get. Is there not something in the boundless seas that raises wonder to its utmost height? Yes, as I gaze on this inspiring sight, fancy and reason, hope and joy combined, bring their rich treasure from the realm of light, and seem even wilder than the waves or wind as they in beauty varied sweep across my mind. I quote that not because it's any better than the one before, but it comes under a series called South Australian Lyrics. It's obvious that the definitional difficulties I've talked about crop up here. Doubtless it's a South Australian lyric because it was written by someone who was resident in South Australia. It had no connection to South Australia in any except the most generalised, vaguely literary terms. You will know, on the other hand, that the journalism of the first half of the 19th century was particularly rooted in the realities of the day and much coloured by the personalities of their editors. In most cases, the editors were the chief reporters, they were usually the owner and the publisher, and by inherited tradition, chief assassination of reputations. There were laws of libel at this time, but they were so infrequently enforced, or enforced so weakly, things like farthing damages, that until the latter part of the century, journalists could say very much as they thought fit, risking, it's true, the occasional horsewhipping, and more often retaliation in kind, but in the main licensed to disparage, impugn, to abuse, to castigate, with such freedom that denigration became a kind of fine art. Hence my reason for bringing this topic. If ever there was a tenuous connection, that's just about it, I should think. It's little wonder that modern journalism in South Australia seems rather pallid by comparison. Perhaps Adelaide more than most. The Harold Titterman type of review just seems so totally anemic compared with the review which I will quote later on a similar sort of occasion. But the time has come to demonstrate further some of the liveliness of South Australia's journalism. Firstly, this is literally a random extract from that St Patrick's Day Society dinner. When I changed jobs, I've lost all my papers, and so this I found by accident in another paper which I never did finish, so I had to quote literally the bit that fell into my hands. The St Patrick's Society dinner was reported in the Mercury, and the health of the Governor, Sir Henry Young, having been drunk, the report continues. Drunk with great applause, after which Dr. Eads was called upon to propose errand, which he did in the most extraordinary style. The bulk of his speech being quotations from Moore, with a playful use of what he was pleased to call associations, a word which he lugged in at least 20 times in half a dozen sentences. Of all the vulgar, claptrap, balderdash we have ever listened to, this display exceeded. But we must add that the manner in which it was received was most creditable to the good taste and common sense of the doctor's countrymen. At the conclusion of this foolery, the worthy chairman volunteered a song, and sung with much humour the favourite ditty of St Patrick was a gentleman, which was received with great laughter. The sheriff then gave the commercial interest of the colony in a good-tempered and very humorous speech, drunk with great cheering and responded to by Mr Morris Marks. The social texture shows up even in that respect. Morris Marks, of course, scarcely from the Emerald Isle. Song Dr Knott, I plucked the fairest flower. Mr Kingston then gave the toast, prosperity of the St Patrick Society, which was drunk up standing amid terrific cheering. After which the chairman called on Mr Lazar for a song, who we think rather infelicitously selected the Groves of Blarney. During its commencement, he was vociferously hissed by a person named Murphy, who had appeared from the remarks of his second friend Dr Eads, came there especially to sing that particular song and insisted that no one else had a right to sing it. The chairman remonstrated with this individual in vain, when after a lengthened uproar, during which it was proposed, but unfortunately not carried out, to kick Mr Murphy downstairs, which would have been the proper treatment for such a vulgar brawler, Mr Lazar proceeded with his song, which was attentively listened to and applauded with the exception of the opposition singer. Quietness being apparently restored, Dr Cotter arose to respond to the toast, but again threw down the apple of discord by injudiciously asserting that then, as on a former occasion, the disturbance was not caused by an Irishman, and so on it goes. The former occasion resulted in one of the participants drawing a rather rusty cutlass and waving around his head and about to reenact the Battle of the Boyne there and then. In any case, I've quoted simply to show that there was no restraint on personalities, no attempt to be tactful, and that they had a kind of freedom And I think the freedom shows in the prose. I think it's good prose, strong prose. The probable writer of this piece, Hammond, had a reputation for scurrility, which was survived for almost 20 years after his departure to Port Phillip in Geelong. But just to demonstrate the style was a familiar one, here is a theatre review written by John Stevens of the South Australian Register, a respected churchman and a Johnny Drinkwater teetotaler, as well as a journalist. We are always desirous of encouraging every innocent recreation and unwilling to injure private interests in our remarks upon public amusements. In that spirit, we have frequently noticed the performances at the theatre giving most ungrudgingly the praise we consider the manager deserved for keeping the house open when, it appeared to us, the attendance was not sufficient to protect him from loss. Our notices were occasional, as our visits were irregular, but whenever we referred to the Lazars as actors, we did so in terms of commendation. We were not critically severe on anything. We made every allowance for the insufficient support received, and we were complacent enough to suppose there was really no histrionic camel in the colony except that possessed by the manager, his family, and the ladies and gentlemen whose sweet voices he had secured. We sneered not at the taste, but with such appliance it suggested the production of a grand oriental spectacle, or the manner in which they were got up, the miserable contrivances were passed over, the shabby wardrobe unnoticed, the wretched scenery uncondemned, though never appropriate to the piece, nor in keeping with itself, and seldom shifted in the intended position until it was time to move it again, whilst through the openings the audience were favoured with long-drawn vistas in that terra incognita, the back of the stage. We complain not of trees and flowers growing in the recesses of Donaldson Keep, or marble columns swinging from the deck of a vessel. We are content to imagine a little back parlour, a Parisian saloon, a cottage with a practical door, an Italian colonnade. We carried critical forbearance further, and in consideration of the rapid succession of novelties, were satisfied with as much of each piece as the players and the prompters pleased to give us. Nor do we protest against curtailments of the one, nor the interpolations of the other. We forgave alike the ruthless scissors of the manager and the treacherous memory of the mimic, who frequently substituted his own music mistakes for the ponderous levity of his author. We have heretofore only noticed to praise, or with mute, expressive silence mused our disapprobation, but we can pursue that course no longer without dereliction of duty. For some time past, we have noticed with pain that Lazar, to provoke a laugh, never hesitates to broach indecency. He deals out with unblushing effrontery allusions culled from or calculated for the especial gratification of the ladies of Knight Square, the Red Light District, who are, we confess, his firmest supporters. But on Saturday last, he exceeded himself, and so outraged propriety as to merit the interference of the police, who are, we imagine, bound to suppress obscenity on the stage, as well as in the saloon or in other public places. If the police have not power to interfere, it is time that such a system of licensing in such places were adopted as would furnish the guardians of the peace, good order and public decency with a proper power to prevent the repetition of immoralities like those referred to. We've seen Lazar so overstep the modesty of nature as to compel even the prostitutes to blush and send the indignant blood tingling to the ear tips of every man in the house. There can, to our minds, be no greater, no more dangerous nuisance than an indecently conducted theatre, no greater theatrical atrocity than to announce a juvenile night, to lower the prices so to induce the attempts of young people, and then to present an entertainment not only indecent but brutally and unnaturally so. We praise the man's spirit that keeps open a theatre, even at a loss to himself or his supporters, who can outrage all propriety by the unwarrantable introduction of filthy obscenities in the presence of a mixed audience, including a member of his own family. We are bound to warn all parents against permitting children to attend this hotbed of demoralisation. As the theatre is presently conducted, no man can sit out a performance without being disgusted, no lady can endure the impure precincts without contamination. Well, that's got a kind of force about it, I think. You wonder what it'd be worth in the way of damage in modern journalism. But I cite it not because of what it says, although I think it's interesting, but it is vigorous prose, good prose, lively, and I guess that's my justification. Well, it depends on I turn over pages, sing it lovely. I think the time code said we have another 10 minutes. Well, I was going to quote part from a Cockney tourist exploration of the wilds of East Park lands, because it's a lovely little parody of Sturt's two expeditions in the interior of South Australia. Perhaps I'll give you a go. From my arrival in Adelaide, having been repeatedly told of the unknown state of the interior, and having always had, like Mungo Parks, an ardent desire for adventure, I determined to set out on an exploring expedition up the country, and hand my name down to posterity as a benefactor of the human race in the same illustrious list with a Park, a Young, a Humboldt, and last but not least, Hutton. That's a little sly, because the Young is the Governor Young, who had returned from an expedition up the north. It had run into its fair share of technical difficulties, and he'd been given rather rough handling by the press. And so there's a kind of backhand, a rare local hit to including Young with Mungo Park and Humboldt. Hutton was just a throwaway feud that was being run at the time. Hutton was a painter that Hammond, the writer, didn't much care for, so he should have been for extra measure. Disregarding all representations of my friends, I selected the northeastern route, which I was told was the least frequented. The night previous to my departure, I made my will and wrote an affectionate letter to my dear mother and sisters in England, which I gave my landlady with instructions to post it if I did not return within 3 years. I provided myself with a number of little trinkets such as buttons, glass beads, nails, etc., which trafficked with the natives. Also a couple of blankets, a Britannia metal pot teapot, a cup and saucer, and a small store of provisions. I was armed with a double-barrelled gun and a pair of pistols to defend myself against the ferocious animals which infest these parts, and provide myself with game when my provisions ran short. It was a beautiful, sunshiny morning in December when I sallied forth from the Stag Inn with my knapsack on my back and sped gaily across the parklands till I came to a small bridge. Here I paused and turned back to look at the distant steeples and public houses of Adelaide which glimmered through the dust. My reflections here were of a most painful nature, so much so as almost to make me give up my expedition. Behind me I left civilization, female society, brandy and water, and all other little items which constitute man's happiness in this world. Before me lay a vast and unknown desert, inhabited by savages who might be cannibals for anything I knew of the country. The thought of fame, however, reassured me, and with one bound I crossed the fence. After mounting a slight eminence, my road lay between two fences, and I observed at some distance a large building erected for the purpose of instructing the youth of the country in the English language. A very fine garden by the roadside and so on. That's a reference to Prince Alfred College. I have another example, which is the description of a hanging. There weren't many hangings in Adelaide, but when they were described, they were described with no particular concern to holding back. The particular piece is rather a morbid piece, and it slabs a bit over some of the unpleasant details, but it's good prose nevertheless. Perhaps the bit preceding describing the crowd might be given an example of at least. At 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, the condemned criminal Yates expiated upon the scaffold his brutal murder of a poor shepherd mansfolk. About 800 or 900 people were present. No small audience when you think about it. An Adelaide of some 60,000 total population. The rain, notwithstanding the state of the weather, the rain falling in torrents and making the spectacle additionally dreary. It is pleasurable to record that but very few females were present, and those of a very depraved character. And that might just be enough. Not all journalism is as vivid or as, not to say lurid as that, but it is prose written to immediate practical effect, and I think for that reason, because some of its practitioners were highly skilled, I believe it justifies its place in a seminar such as this. But it would be foolish of me to conclude this necessarily brief account if I made no reference to the vitality that was transfused into the journalism of the day. By any standards, ancient or modern, the colony in its BV days, that's before Ballarat days, was absurdly oversupplied with newspapers. In George Dehaney's 1851 almanac, he lists 10, I won't read them all, and he left out at least 3 others. And to keep newspapers supplied with copy, the editors had to resort to all kinds of stratagems, dummy advertisements, plagiarism from each other, and above all, borrowings from overseas and other colonial newspapers. As a result of this last practice, colonial readers could read some of the best writers of the age. Dickens and Macaulay, Disraeli and Cullen Bryant, some of its best poets, and some of its worst, Mrs. Sigourney, the Connecticut sweet singer she was called, and Henry Parkes. You knew he wrote, what's it called, Pleasurable Moments? That was published in one of the South Australian papers. A terrible set of verse it is. These borrowed plumes, however, do accord surprisingly well with the locally produced material. The standard of local writing was high, aimed for an audience of superior literary accomplishment. Obviously, the practical concerns of a pragmatic society limited the range of subjects discussed. Many of them were mundane and extreme, and could only interest the most dogged historians. There remains, however, in most issues of most papers written at this time, ample evidence of my claim that colonial journalism can be regarded as one of the lively arts of the 19th century, at least during the first 20 years of the colony's existence. I feel much less sure about the journalism written after 1858 than when the Advertiser and the Chronicle and Register collectively came to dominate Adelaide's newspaper world. As the century advanced, the closer Adelaide's newspapers came to Buller Lytton's ironical sketch in the novel The Caxton, well conducted, well edited by a man of the world, of education, of practical experience in agriculture and human nature, mines, corn, manure, the state of parties, and the best interests of society. Why there should be a decline in liveliness, I am perfectly prepared to accept it may very well be in my perception. Maybe I feel happier in the 1840s and 1850s and those more racy times in the 1860s, 70s, 80s and 90s. But it was a more settled society. The gold rush did in fact take away some of its most talented writers. One of them died suddenly in John Stevens. George Stevenson drifted out of journalism. Allen's sold his share of the Times, and Hammond went to chasing wealth in Victoria and didn't succeed in getting, I might say. There was improved communication between the newspapers of the world at that particular time. And whereas the papers of the 1840s and 50s were virtually all things for all men, literary magazine, Reader's Digest in their borrowings, by the time the 1860s arrived, news was coming much more directly from overseas. The steamers shortened the trip. But steam had one other effect, I believe. It also changed the readership. It reduced the price of newspapers dramatically. Education, though not universal, certainly was more widely spread. So more people could read, pay less for their papers, but I think on average the standard of literacy of the readership would have declined and the writing would have been adjusted to meet that decline in average. In any case, that's highly speculative. Perhaps I ought to escape while I can, but if it isn't exactly the most orthodox definition of a lively art, I believe in its vitality and its life. The journalist of the 1840s and 50s, I think, has a case.
Would you like to expand on the Mercury? Wonderful paper.
Yeah. Well, the Mercury's not a respectable paper, it never was. And it's atypical in a way, although there were papers like it in the other colonies. In fact, it was very closely modelled on Punch and Sporting Life, a sort of a colonial version of those two British papers. And when Hammond left South Australia, he established, I think it was called the Melbourne Punch for a short time, and peddled that kind of scurrility in other places for most of his career. But the Mercury itself is something of a gem, I think. Those of you who read newspapers, this will be old hat, but there's a tremendous amount of dross in newspapers, and I think the Mercury's got its fair share of it. There's a lot of it deals with things like breeding horses, horse races, most unfunny accounts of pugilistic contents and equestrian events of that kind. But it's on very lively ground when it starts cutting reputations to shreds, and it does that with great enthusiasm. The laws of libel I glossed over. Many of them did in fact end up in law courts, and in my own view, the suit which William Giles brought against the Mercury in the mid-1851 did in fact hasten the decline of that magazine, although as I've said elsewhere, it was declining for other reasons. The humour was getting sharper, getting harder to manage, and in order to make an impact, the statements were becoming increasingly outrageous. I think humour is one of those things that doesn't lend itself to a long career. I don't know about you, I used to assiduously read Des Cahoon's bits in the Advertiser, and I was amused by them in the early days, but I'm finding them almost impossible to read. Now, that's probably a sign of my age. But I think lightness of touch is a bit of a hit and miss thing, and when you've got to be funny for a living, I think you run awful risks. And I think Hammond made bad judgment. Instead of establishing a lighter tone, he really let fire with all guns from the very beginning. And you run out of tricks after a while. He ran out of and eventually he became increasingly scurrilous, and eventually even the much abused William Giles, the Bishop of Baghdad he called him, even the much abused bishop had to take him to court, and he won this time substantial damages, got a public retraction from Hammond, who would not apologise to the devil, I would have thought, and eventually he just faded from the scene. But I think it's probably the nature of the paper, but it's a marvellous paper to read, I believe. We know something about the numbers, although not the numbers of readers. There's one issue of the Mercury, for instance, where he boasted of having to run another 4,000 copies to satisfy the demand. I divide that by 10 myself, but a readership of about 1,000, when papers were costing about sixpence, as most of them were, really meant they were very much confined to a certain social class. Well, that's the bias belonged to a certain social class. In Clara Morrison, you may remember, Clara borrowed her cousin's newspapers, and there's no doubt the newspapers had multiple readers, that they were handed around as we would hand around a paperback among friends, and they would be read by many, and we'd have very little account of that. We know that some of the coffee houses carried them as entertainment for their patrons, and so did some of the pubs. The reading room of the Philosophical Society and the Institute carried the newspapers. I don't know much more than that, except you get an idea of the readership from the people who wrote letters to the editor, or those who were dismissed by the editor. This is absolute rubbish, go and pester our contemporary down the road, that kind of response. But those who had published material clearly wrote as educated men, and some of them so determined to make sure that they were seen as educated men, quoted themselves crazy, just to make sure their credentials were well established. But there was a good, but that may be atypical, because you wonder whether even anyone who writes the editor is a typical reader. I doubt it. No, I don't want to go any further than that.
So I found your reference to the account of the hanging very tantalising and wondered what came later. But I particularly wondered whether the rather gory accounts of such an event as the hanging would have been dressed up in some sort of rather preaching style, so that it was it purported to be a sort of lesson to the public as to what happened to even do it. So was it quite unashamedly an appeal to mass curiosity and bloodthirstiness?
Well, it depends where you read the accounts of hangings and various executions of various kinds. Dickens writes one or two good patches of good descriptions of executions, but he concentrated on the audience rather than on the act itself. This particular example was it had any kind of point other than to entertain by its morbidity. It was to chastise the hangman not knowing his business very well, because perhaps I can remember the reference to the wretch who was unrepentant when Dr. Bacchus tried to persuade him to be contrite and kicked his boots off into the crowd with the utmost hardihood, was the phrase. He becomes poor wretch when the hanging in fact was badly mismanaged. So there's a Bobbage way in it, and I think perhaps as far as the accounts of hanging in the colonial press, there's a Bobbage way also, that they would titillate on the one hand and sing and press exercises primarily, though they did disguise them in some kind of sanctimonious moral point, usually in the last sentence.